Hello everyone, welcome back to another Xile Rants video. Today we are discussing the American economy. We've had some new data come out last week that indicates sort of the general direction that the American economy is heading, and we had kind of Liberation Day Part 2, where the tariffs that were put on pause for 90 days, the actual official rates moving forward have been announced and have been implemented. So I wanted to take this opportunity to kind of give my opinion and look at some data about a sort of holistic view of the American economy and what I think the future holds. Spoiler alert, it is not good. I think we are looking at the beginning of the end of American economic hegemony, and this will only lead to a very negative outcome, in my opinion at least. Okay, so let's go through exactly what I'll be covering in this video. First, we'll look at the aforementioned new data that's come out of the Bureau of Labor Statistics and other governmental agencies. Then I'll kind of pull back the curtain. I'll engage in, a little bit of conspiracism just for fun. Touch of conspiracism never hurt anyone, right? We'll look at the GDP figures that have come out and the sort of analysis and breakdown of each part of the GDP. We'll look at the trade deals that Trump has managed to negotiate in the 90 days since Liberation Day. We'll look at the sort of status quo, the new state of all of the tariffs on the various nations of the earth. We'll talk about the Federal Reserve at the end and why, it's an important institution and why firing Jerome Powell will be very bad if such a thing comes to pass. And finally, I will end this video with kind of my forecast for the future, and we'll talk about a fun, or not so fun, science fiction idea that I think can help us explain, what the hell is going on. Okay, so first let's touch on the economic data revisions that have just come out from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. First, it's important to note that revisions to this data, to the number of jobs created especially, is not uncommon at all, right? It actually almost always happens. And the reason this happens is because no model is complete, right? The Bureau of Labor Statistics does not interview every single business owner and business person and company in the entire United States. They take a tiny fraction of those groups of people and then they sort of extrapolate the data. What this means is that depending on which model you use, which coefficients you use, which variables you think are more important than others, you can get drastically different outcomes. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the model is only as good as the data you put into it. My dad is a data scientist, and he always says, garbage in, garbage out, right? So you put garbage data into your model, you will get a garbage model as the output. So, that's important to note. The jobs data from last July, meaning 2024, was revised down by 818,000 jobs. That's for the year. Not right before the election. So Trump's been out there saying, the Bureau of Labor Statistics is partisan. They rigged the job data right before the election to make Biden look good. No, the revision that he's talking about happened months before the November election. He lied. Surprise, surprise. But that's just one example of an incident which the revision of data has been accused of partisanship. Okay, so what happened this most recent time? The job growth, so the number of jobs added, has been revised down by 258,000 in a 2-month period. Okay, that is a enormous number, right? So if we look at this graph here, I think the job growth for for May and June was about 150,000, 175,000, okay? It has now been revised down to about 30,000 and 15,000. So that's like, 80, 90% drop in the number of jobs that we expected to add to the economy. And then the job numbers for July for last month have been set at 73,000, but it wouldn't surprise me if those once again get revised down. So, why exactly is this happening? And this is where I need to get a little bit conspiratorial. All right, let's get a little bit conspiratorial here. What exactly is going on with these new jobs figures, with this new jobs data? I have a theory, and I don't have very much like solid evidence for this theory, but it is the only narrative that makes any sort of sense to me. So my theory is this. Basically, after Liberation Day back in April, the business community leaders, now who exactly that is up to you. It could be, Jeffrey Bezos, the Waltons, those weird freaks from Hobby Lobby that stole all those artifacts from Iraq, whatever. They basically sat down with the Trump administration and says, look, these tariffs are going to hurt us, but if you make these deals in 90 days like you say you're going to, and basically the worst of the tariffs will go away in 90 days, we are willing to eat the costs of these tariffs, basically not pass on those costs to consumers as much as possible, and report to all the relevant government agencies that job growth is positive, job growth is steady, as long as when those 90 days are up, you reverse course and make everything go back to normal, basically. And this was some sort of deal, an unspoken agreement that they had with each other. And of course, 90 days later, the tariffs are back, and they are worse than they were during that 90-day period. So all the business leaders were like, well, shoot, if these tariffs are real, if they're not going away, if they are something that will impact my business in the long run, they basically no longer cared about lying to the Bureau of Labor Statistics to make the Trump administration look good. And that's why the job reports were revised and cut by, 80, 85%. By the way, those cuts were the 45th and 50th largest cuts in history in terms of absolute numbers, but in percentage-wise, they were much higher than that, okay? So that's what I think happened. Essentially, this deal broke down because the business community held up their end of the deal, but Trump did not honor his side. He did not renege on the tariffs. This is also why I think the taco narrative was pushed so heavily during this period, because Wall Street and the business community essentially was trying to manifest it into existence. They were trying to manifest the fact that Trump would inevitably, in the long run, back down on tariffs, but as we've just recently seen, the opposite is actually happening. So, what's the fallout from this? Well, the first thing that happened is that Trump has fired the head of the Department of Labor Statistics. Now, on the face of it, this is, completely ridiculous. The head of the Department of Labor Statistics, the commissioner, is not the one collecting all this data. All she or he does is report the data as it comes to them. So firing her changes nothing. But what it does do is it does allow him to appoint someone who's going to step in there and fudge the data and massage the data in such a way that makes the Trump administration look good. So basically, we have transitioned to a North Korea/China level of economic data manipulation. I'm going to talk about this more in detail in my next Why Trump Won video, but I will discuss it briefly here. In Trump's first term, that was like the post-truth era, right? The post-truth means you throw 10 narratives at the wall and maybe one or two stick, and those are the ones that you roll with. Post-truth isn't you establish some sort of alternative narrative. It's you poison the water so much and so heavily with a bunch of bullshit that the truth becomes impossible to discern. That's post-truth. We now live in the anti-truth era. Truth, reality itself, is the enemy that must be fought, that the Trump administration is actively taking steps to combat. So, yeah, there is no outcome of this that ends well, okay? In the long run, reality will always win. In the short run, he might be able to lie and fudge the numbers and pretend that the economy is doing fine, even though in reality people are losing their jobs, losing their businesses, losing their livelihoods. Inflation is spiking, things are only getting worse on the ground. And you can pretend that reality doesn't matter until it does. So basically, whether it's 6 months from now, whether it's 2 years from now, whether it's even half a decade from now, in the long run, reality will always win. Another issue with this is that the fudging of American economic data will lead to a loss of faith in the American economy, the American market as a whole. We're already seeing that a little bit with the GDP figures that we'll discuss in a minute, with the ticking down of private investment in American businesses, but this will go so much more beyond that. It's no coincidence that over this couple month period, we've seen the dollar lose almost 8% of its value. People are abandoning the American dollar. People are abandoning the idea of the American economy being a safe harbor for their investments. They are looking elsewhere. And that is not good because it essentially means capital flight from the American economy on a scale that we have literally never seen before. Because in past recessions, right, in, say, 2008 or the Great Depression, every country on Earth was suffering the effects of the Depression at the same time. But with this new one, it's really just the U.S. mainly that is going through the ringer here. So there actually is more lucrative and better alternatives for foreign investment. And I predict that we will see a large amount of capital flight from the U.S. over the next year or so. The weird thing about all of this is that the stock market and the treasury yields, if you just looked at those, you wouldn't think anything is wrong. The treasury yields have actually been dropping over the past couple days. Well, they had a big drop, and then they've climbed up a little bit since then, but mostly they've been dropping. And the stock market had one big, 1.5% dip on the day the tariffs are announced, but they've since recovered. So if you just look at those two metrics, you wouldn't think anything is wrong. Basically, the entire U.S. economy right now is a bubble of cope, a bubble of hype, whatever you want to call it. The underlying assumption that things will return to normal, taco, whatever you want to call it, I think is fundamentally untrue. And I have proof that it's a bubble. So if you look down here at this graph, this is the graph of the U.S. stock market over the past 5 years, and you can see that it's grown by about 100%. Okay, so that means the U.S. stock market has doubled in a 5-year period. Now, ask yourself, does that make sense? Is the amount of goods that the U.S. economy is producing doubled? Has the amount of services that you are able to afford, that companies are providing, doubled in the past 5 years? The answer is obviously no. So not only is the U.S. stock market clearly in a bubble, and more recently I think a large part of that bubble can be attributed to specifically AI, right? So if you look at the gains, say in the past 6 months, most of the gains of the stock market have actually come from a handful of tech companies, NVIDIA, Microsoft, Apple, companies like that. And those are all companies, what do they all have in common? They've invested heavily in the AI space. And the Trump administration is also using government funds to invest heavily in the AI space. Now, I'm not an expert or anything on AI or the tech sector, but in my opinion, AI as it exists right now is almost completely worthless. It doesn't actually provide any real value, any real service. I mean, you can use ChatGPT to write emails, but you could also just sit there and write an email. And AI at this point is not evolved to the point where you don't need someone to double check its work. So it's effectively worthless. The only real use case I've found for it is generating YouTube thumbnails, which, okay, great. you might have saved a couple of labor hours there with that. But yeah, that the point of all of this is that with these new job numbers and with the actions that the Trump administration has been recently taking, we are now going to enter an era where the data that we get about the American economy is going to be completely divorced from reality, and this is going to have very real, long-term, and negative consequences. This picture at the top right is a joke, admittedly, but it wouldn't surprise me if we literally see, Trump administration officials going on Fox News every month and touting the official numbers of, 5% job market growth or something ridiculous like that. And everyone just has to either follow along with it, or they're simply not allowed to be invited into the White House press pool anymore if you don't go along with the official narrative. And obviously, this is the common theme amongst tin pot dictatorships, which the U.S. is rapidly becoming. All right, let's take a look at the favorite metric of every economist on Earth, the gross domestic product, aka the GDP. First, we'll start with this top graph. As we can see here, for last year, GDP growth was consistently positive. For the first quarter of this year, it contracted slightly, and then once again coming around to the second quarter, it hit that 3% target, which sounds good on paper, but we'll talk about why that actually hides a lot of issues. So first of all, why did GDP contract in the first quarter of this year? I think a lot of it was the absolute explosion we saw in imports, right? So Trump has been threatening tariffs, he's been threatening tariffs, he's been threatening tariffs, and every company on earth was like, shoot, well, I don't want to be impacted by those tariffs. So every single company who could afford to massively increase their stockpile of whatever goods they sell, and that exploded our trade deficit. So our trade deficit for quarter one was actually much worse than the previous year because all these companies were essentially stocking up for the bad times that they expected to be ahead. And then Q2, as we will see, the reverse happened. Okay, so what exactly makes up the gross domestic product? There are four things, okay, four components, you could say, of the GDP. Consumption, that is us. That is the money that we spend. Every time we go to the grocery store and buy a loaf of bread or get a haircut or a new car or a house, all of that is under the umbrella of consumption. The next one is government spending. That is all the money the government spends on missiles and healthcare and the salaries of their employees and the natural parks and yada, yada, yada. Government spends a lot of money, especially the American government. The next component is private investment. That includes both foreign and domestic investment. So that is, instead of buying a good, that is you are buying a stock, or you are giving loans to a business. Okay, that's private investment. And the last one is the trade deficit. So that is total exports minus total imports. For the vast majority of recorded quarters, that trade deficit for the United States has been negative because we have a trade deficit. But again, as I've discussed in other videos, that is not necessarily a bad thing. So let's look at this breakdown for specifically quarter two of 2025. First, we have consumer spending. Consumer spending rose by about 1%. Okay, sure, whatever. It's not that significant of an increase. The real worrying one is the drop in investment. We've had about a 3% drop in investment, and that is a significant number. So all of this talk of, we're going to have the Japanese come in, we're going to have the Taiwanese come in, we're going to have all these foreign countries invest in the American workforce, invest in the American manufacturing space. No, it's just simply not happening. The numbers tell a different story. So we'll talk about this more later, but anytime a country promises to invest so much money into America, there's nothing actually binding them to those words. They don't actually, no, basically no one in the Trump administration is checking to make sure they actually do that. So in a lot of cases, they simply aren't. This tariff business has also created turmoil and uncertainty, and turmoil and uncertainty disincentivizes investment because all of a sudden the long-term stability of the American economy starts to look shakier. So people are less willing to put their money into U.S. companies. Okay, government spending rose by basically nothing, very negligible amount. Export shrank a tiny amount. Again, that's a pretty negligible amount. The real massive chunk, the real difference between quarter one and quarter two is the absolute destruction of imports. We're seeing a 5% drop in total imports. That represents a giant chunk of the total amount of goods that we bring into this country. So that's obviously because of the tariffs, right? So the tariffs actually start kicking in April, and all of a sudden it's much more expensive to import, car parts or fertilizer or meat or microchips or whatever. And that is obviously very bad if you're a American business owner, or if you're an American factory owner too, because most factories, right, in America at least, take component parts from around the world and then they assemble it into something worth more than the sum of its parts. So that's why the GDP, on paper at least, has gone up. But again, this is really, if we look at the factors that actually matter, consumer spending and investment, the GDP has actually shrank by a significant amount. So really, in my opinion at least, this GDP figure is very, very misleading because it essentially says, the total amount of goods and services provided by the American economy has shrunk, but the GDP has still gone up. It doesn't make sense on the face of it, but that's the way GDP is calculated. I didn't make the rules, All right, next up, we'll play a little game of deal or no deal and talk about the deals that Trump and his administration has or has really not negotiated. Okay, so the first and the biggest issue, and it is still an ongoing issue, it has not been resolved, even really in the slightest, is that all of the government jobs, all of the people that used to do all of this trade deal business, that used to lead these negotiations, go to the foreign countries, meet with their trade representatives, etc., they've all been fired, right? I think about 85% of the entire workforce that worked on those departments under Trump 1 and under the Obama administration have all been fired. And only about 20% of those jobs have been filled since then. So we're looking at, roughly 3/4, maybe 2/3 less people that are actually able to negotiate all of this. Because it takes a long time and a lot of effort to negotiate a real trade deal. Slapping tariffs is easy, right? Anybody can just go up there and say, boom, 15% tariff, boom, 10% tariff. That's easy. But actually sitting down, going line by line, good by good, negotiating a trade deal that benefits both parties, that is very, very, very difficult, and it takes a lot of time. The shortest trade deal ever negotiated in American history was with Singapore, and it took 8 whole months. So all of these deals I'm going to discuss aren't even really trade deals in the traditional sense. They're really just an agreement on tariff rates, but a lot of the underlying issues have not been addressed, have not been fixed. The other thing I need to say is that just because Trump says a deal is made does not mean a deal is made. I'm only going to be going over the trade deals that representatives from the other country have said are happening. Because Trump just likes to tweet shit, and he'll say we have a trade deal with Egypt or something, and the Egyptian government will be like, no, nobody from our side has agreed to anything. But someone in Trump's administration has told him, they're working on a trade deal, or maybe they've made progress, and he'll interpret that as a trade deal has been signed or has been inked. All it needs is a stamp, or yeah. So a Truth Social post does not a trade deal make. Okay, we'll start with some countries that have the initial steps done. They have some sort of framework in place, but no actual deal put to paper. The first and most advanced, meaning the closest to an actual deal, is the EU. The EU tariff rate has been set at, I think, 15%, and of course 0% on American goods, theoretically. And there are some exceptions and caveats to all of that, but there's still about a 30% of goods that are exported from the EU to America that the tariff rate on those has not been successfully negotiated. A big one is pharmaceuticals, right? The Europeans produce a lot of pharmaceutical companies. There are a lot of very profitable, very technically advanced European pharmaceutical companies that definitely don't want to lose access to the US market. So that is a very sticky point of negotiations. Then we have the Philippines. They're basically nothing. I mean, he met with, I think it's Marcos, and they basically just agreed that they would negotiate, and nothing else has come of that. Indonesia, Trump knocked down the tariff rate on them to, I think, also 15%, but again, they're still in the very early stages of negotiation. The UK deal is actually hilarious because we knocked their tariff rate down to 10%, which is like the lowest out of any major country. But in exchange, the United Kingdom has agreed to buy fewer planes from Boeing than they were initially buying. So we gave them a better deal, and they said, we'll actually buy less planes from you, but Trump treated it as a victory because, of course, he doesn't know how this works, because he doesn't actually know what the hell he's doing or what is going on. And finally, we have the China situation. Again, the framework has been established. Trump has said that there's now a 30% tariff on all Chinese goods, and there's a whole other conversation about transshipping. But only the bare framework of the deal has been negotiated. Luckily, this is important, rare earth element exports to the U.S. have been resumed. For a while, China was threatening to cut off those rare earth element exports. That would have been absolutely disastrous to any sort of high-tech manufacturing in the U.S. They could literally kneecap the entire American economy with that simple move, but luckily they haven't done that. Trump negotiated them to resume those exports. So that's actually a good thing that he did. But again, in terms of like intellectual property and agriculture, and there's a million, TikTok, God, there's a million finer points to this potential trade deal that have yet to be negotiated. Okay, and then we have the actual trade deals, of which, in my opinion, there are literally only three: South Korea, Vietnam, and Japan. Basically, we'll start with Vietnam. Vietnam's probably one of the most important ones because a lot of our manufacturing actually moved to Vietnam following COVID. So before COVID, the typical American company had all of their stuff manufactured in China. But then people realized that, hey, maybe it's not such a great idea that all of our supply chains are tied up in a country who, on a whim, can essentially shut down their economy. They basically felt that the state had too much control over their economy and thus over the potential business operations of the factories that these companies work with / own. So a lot of that industry has since moved down to Vietnam. Things like clothing, motorcycles, anything electronic that doesn't involve semiconductors. Yeah, all of that stuff has largely moved to Vietnam. And the Vietnamese are very happy about it. I mean, their economy is doing phenomenal right now, to be honest. So they're thrilled about that. But that also means that they were one of the priority countries, you could say, when it came to negotiating with the U.S., and they were actually, if you believe Trump, one of the first countries to reach out. So they successfully negotiated a trade deal. I think the tariff rate was settled on 15%, and they agreed to not, ship out Chinese goods under the guise of Vietnamese goods, or under the flag of Vietnam. South Korea and Japan have a similar story to each other. I think their tariff rates were also set at 15%, and they, of course, handle the higher end manufacturing. In exchange for their participation or cooperation in these trade deals, they have both agreed to buy a significant amount of American energy. Okay? But here's the thing, they were already doing that. The amount of energy that they've pledged to buy has not substantially increased. And energy in this case means petroleum, refined petroleum, liquefied natural gas. Yeah. So really, once again, we get basically nothing from this trade deal in terms of meaningful changes. The only difference is that every good now that you buy from South Korea or Japan is going to be 15% more expensive. Yippee. I've seen a lot of conversation about why South Korea and Japan don't want to buy, for example, American cars. Well, I actually went to South Korea and Japan recently, and I think I can provide a bit of insight. Go to your local Ford dealership. Okay, go to your local Ford dealership, take a little vacation. What do you notice about all of the cars? They are ginormous, okay? The average size of an American truck or SUV has been growing year over year over year. There are a lot of reasons for this. Car companies want to basically be able to charge you more per car, so they just increase the amount of car that you are buying. But the thing is, the roads in Japan and South Korea are very narrow. They're very small. Their cities are planned out in such a way that a lot of their alleyways are not built to accommodate giant American-sized trucks. So that's why American cars do not do well in those markets. And we don't sell the kind of, compact, regular family four-door car anymore. I mean, I think Ford is the only one left that even makes those anymore. Chrysler doesn't make them anymore. And I don't think Dodge does either now. I don't think they even offer those options. So that's the main reason why American automobiles do not sell well in the East Asian market. Okay? So the headline is that essentially the goal was to, ostensibly at least, to reduce tariffs on American goods, and that has largely been accomplished. Okay? Great. And then we have 15 to 30% tariffs on most foreign goods, which is not good. And I already mentioned that the foreign investment that all of these countries are promising in return for these lower tariff rates have yet to materialize in any meaningful way. Okay, so let's talk about the new deals and the new tariff rates that were just announced. So first of all, the taco mantra, I think, is completely outdated now. I think that, everyone was touting the taco mantra in order to pretend like the Trump obsession with tariffs was just an aberration, was just a phase, but it's not just a phase. It's real, it's happening, it's here to stay. I think taco should be rebranded as Trump always commits openly, because he loves tariffs and he will not shut up about them. The point of all these tariffs was ostensibly to eliminate all tariffs foreign countries had on U.S. goods, and this has largely been accomplished, at least with most of the countries that we've signed or have negotiated frameworks with. But again, most of those tariffs were, fairly negligible, and it's not like a reduction in tariffs is going to automatically lead to a surge in U.S. exports, especially with all of the geopolitical harm, geopolitical damage that these tariffs have caused, particularly amongst our allies. We've been seeing this with Canada, especially, where they've had huge boycotts against all sorts of American goods. The American tourism industry has completely collapsed. Las Vegas is a ghost town. Every week it seems like a new bourbon distillery goes bankrupt in Kentucky, and those are just the examples I can list off the top of my head. I'm sure if you just go across the country, you'll find businesses all over the place that are negatively affected by the cessation of business with our friends up in Canada. And that's just one country, too. That's not to mention all the other countries that Trump has royally pissed off. Speaking of royally pissing off countries, Brazil is being slapped with 50% tariffs, the highest tariffs of any sovereign nation. And the reason has absolutely nothing to do with reciprocal tariffs. In fact, or trade deficits. In fact, Brazil actually had a negative trade deficit with the U.S. before Liberation Day, meaning we exported more goods to them than we imported from them. Brazil is being punished for prosecuting the former President Bolsonaro, who was a right-wing populist, kind of similar to Trump in some ways. So great. We are punishing a foreign country for something that has nothing to do with economics, and once again throwing out the playbook that Trump himself established. Right? You eliminate tariffs on us, we'll eliminate tariffs on you. Nope, just kidding. Obviously, this is ridiculous. And, you know, imagine living in a country where you actually prosecute your former presidents for crimes that they committed while they were in office. Couldn't be me. The other big change that has been announced recently is the 50% tariffs for anyone who buys oil from Russia, and this will mainly affect India and China. Now, I am not necessarily opposed to using tariffs as a geopolitical tool, as a geopolitical weapon. I think that is a perfectly valid way or reason to implement tariffs. However, specifically for oil, I think it is not a good idea, because every barrel of Russian oil that can no longer be sold on the global market means a barrel of oil that must come from the Middle East or from Norway or from America or from Venezuela, whatever. And that means that if India and China stop buying oil from Russia, yes, it means that Russia's main source of revenue in their ongoing war against Ukraine will be cut, but it will also mean the price of oil skyrockets globally, which means more expensive energy, more expensive gas prices for you, which means lots and lots of nasty inflation for everyone. So I'm not exactly sure what the solution here is. The Western countries have been recently cracking down on the Russian shadow fleet. They're already implemented basically a price ceiling on Russian oil, so Russia can't sell their oil above this certain price, which ensures that they don't get that much profits from it. Both of those are pretty reasonable solutions. I'm not sure, honestly, if this 50% tariff is a good idea, especially since we really need India on our side geopolitically, and if China's cut off from Russian oil, I mean, they're one of the largest consumers of oil in the world. It would be completely disastrous for the global economy, not just the US economy, not just the Chinese economy. So I don't really buy the 50% tariff thing, and who knows, he probably won't even follow through with it anyway, because he just says stuff. The other big one I saw that he announced right before I sat down to record this is a 100% tariff on semiconductors. I pray to God he doesn't do that, because the US has, I think, one chip manufacturing center in Phoenix, Arizona. There are several under construction, but until we get more online, all adding a 100% tariff on Taiwanese chips, foreign-made chips, is going to do is hurt the American computer space, the American high-tech sector. There's literally no point, right? They're already building all these new factories as fast as they can. Slapping on a 100% tariff isn't magically going to make these factories get built any faster. That's not how it works. Now let's look at the specific tariff rates. I think in previous segments I gave some slightly wrong figures, so I'll correct myself when applicable. First of all, Mexico. Mexico's at a 25% tariff right now, except for car parts, I think. I think that exception is still in force, and that exception has been extended for another 90-day period while negotiations continue. In my opinion, a trade deal with Mexico should be the number one strategic goal of the Trump administration right now. But of course, they don't listen to me. It's not like there are Trump administration officials watching my video. So I don't think that's going to happen. We'll see. Scheinbaum's been playing hardball. We'll see if anything actually comes of it. The headline is the U.S. needs Mexico a lot more than Mexico needs the U.S. Mexico can sell their products, their goods to any country on earth, but we are heavily, heavily dependent on Mexican imports for a enormous variety of goods. Okay. Then China, we already talked about China. 30% tariff right now. The deal framework is there, but nothing real has been negotiated yet. We'll see. Canada is actively under their new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, is taking a very hardline stance against America. I already mentioned all the boycotts and stuff. Trump calling them the 51st state certainly hasn't helped matters. I don't think we'll be seeing a trade deal with Canada anytime soon. Germany falls under the purview of the EU. They're at a 15% tariff right now. Like I said, pharmaceuticals still need to be negotiated. Japan, I already mentioned. Vietnam, I made a mistake. It's a 20% tariff, not a 15% tariff. I already mentioned South Korea. Taiwan, the semiconductor thing is the main export of Taiwan. I hope that the 100% tariff on semiconductors doesn't actually go through. Ireland, part of the EU. India, there's another big one. 25% tariff on India. Like Vietnam, India has a lot of sort of medium tech manufacturing, and they are very competitive in a lot of those spaces. So I think that they are an important ally, important economic partner of the U.S. going forward. Italy is part of the EU. UK, like I said, they have the lowest amount, 10%. Good luck. Keir Starmer, good luck in negotiating with this rampant narcissist. Switzerland, whatever. We buy clocks from them and chocolate. Who cares? Thailand is also like Vietnam and like India, is a leader in the sort of medium tech industrial space. Air conditioners, machine parts. Those are some of the things that they specialize in. And I think it would be wise for the Trump administration to negotiate directly with them in the future. All right, we're going to go slightly off topic now and talk about the Federal Reserve. I don't know where else I'm going to put this in any of my other videos, so I really wanted to talk about it now. There has been a lot of right-wing conspiracism about the Federal Reserve for a very, very long time. But the reality is that we need the Federal Reserve, okay? The modern economy, the way it's structured, would not survive without the Federal Reserve. If you want to get rid of the Federal Reserve, so if you have a currency that is a fiat currency, meaning a currency that is not, backed by gold or silver or land, or is a cowrie shell or something, if you have a currency that is a piece of paper that is backed by a government, you basically only have three options on who controls that money supply, who can print, who can make more money. The first option is that the executive branch or the president can control the money supply, but obviously this is a huge problem because what is a president's number one priority? I'll give you a second to think about it. That's right, being reelected. Everything else is secondary to being reelected. How do you get reelected? Well, theoretically, you should make people happy. And what's a great way to make people happy? You give them free money. We saw this, during the pandemic when they were handing out stimulus checks like candy. So if you give the president control of the money supply, there is absolutely nothing stopping them from every time their poll numbers are dipping to just going to the printing press and just churning out a couple, $100 billion and distributing it amongst the masses. Again, this is fine in the short term, but in the long term, this leads to, double-digit inflation year after year, which is obviously terrible. So that's not really an option. The other option you can do is you can let private interests, you can let the business community, you can let Wall Street control the money supply. But this is also not really a viable option because the whole point of the Federal Reserve, right, is to balance inflation and unemployment. So if you give control of the money supply to business interests, when things are going okay, they're going to massively cut interest rates, which is going to lead to massive amounts of inflation, which is inevitably going to cause a depression. Then they'll slam on the interest rates. They'll make them sky high. It'll jack up unemployment to the moon, but it will lower inflation, and then hopefully things will normalize out as fast as possible, and then the whole cycle will repeat over and over again. Basically, what will happen is we will have a 2008 style depression, recession, boom bust cycle every 5 years, as opposed to every decade or 2 decades. And this is obviously not sustainable. It'll mean that the U.S. economy is constantly in a state of flux, constantly in a state of absolute chaos and turmoil, and inflation in the long run will also be higher than normal. The third option, and the option that we actually use, is a independent agency can control the money supply. And the independent part is important because it means that the Fed, the Federal Reserve, as a nonpartisan institution that is not governed by politics, whose members are not elected, they are appointed, is not subject to the whims and demands of politicians or the electorate. And this is actually a good thing. It may seem undemocratic, but trust me, this is actually a good thing because this allows the Fed to act as a stabilizing force that can act above everybody's short-term interests. Because the Fed is ultimately concerned with the long-term stability, the long-term health of the American economy. They don't care about the short-term costs. They don't care about the short-term interests. And that is actually a good thing because it means there is a solid foundation to the U.S. economy. That just because the economic forecast in the short term may look bad, it doesn't mean that the money supply will just completely explode due to some short-term naive planning. And this helps build faith, it helps build trust, and it is one of the things that makes America such an economic powerhouse, such a safe place to invest in and put your money in. But all of that changes if Trump fires Colin Powell. Colin Powell is I believe, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and if he is fired, it will seriously call into question the independence of the Federal Reserve. This will, on average, lower the demand for U.S. Treasury bonds, which will mean that the interest rate on said U.S. Treasury bonds will increase, which means the interest rates for everything in America will increase. So, if you were planning on refinancing your mortgage, good luck. The interest rate will have increased, 2-3% in the past year. And that goes for loans on, cars, businesses, everything. So obviously that is a terrible, terrible outcome, and it will, in the short term, maybe the Trump administration will be able to convince their puppet to slash interest rates, but in the long term, this will only lead to a shakier foundation, higher inflation, and even in the long term, higher interest rates as capital gets pulled out of the American economy as people stop investing in these treasury bonds. All right, let's wrap things up with a bit of future speculation. So I guess one of the questions that's been on my mind ever since Trump took office is, what's the point? Like, why tariffs? Are they crashing the American economy on purpose? Like, what's the end game here? And I think a book that I read a couple years ago can give us some insight. So there's this science fiction book written by William Gibson of Neuromancer fame called The Peripheral. And The Peripheral takes place across two time periods, one set in the 2030s and one set in the 2100s, the early 22nd century. In between these two time periods, an event known as the jackpot occurs. And it is essentially, global warming and deforestation and habitat destruction finally catching up with us. It is an ecological catastrophe which wipes out roughly 80% of the human population and almost every single living species on Earth. But the real kicker is what all of the people do, because the oligarchs, the wealthy, use this ecological catastrophe to essentially cash out of the entire global economy. So they take all of the money that has been pooled in, offshore accounts and speculation and private equity, and they use that to gobble up whatever assets remain, and then they essentially pull out. They retreat to their mansions, to their villas, to their private islands, to their underground bunkers, and let the rest of the world to rot, essentially. And I think that this is the direction that we're heading, you know? I don't think it's a coincidence that all these tech CEOs, Zuckerberg, Sam Altman, are buying private islands and building these massive, you know, underground bunkers. That is something they are doing. That is not a conspiracy theory. We know that that is happening. I think that those in power, the oligarchs, the rich, know that the system that they are building is completely unsustainable, but they hope that they can use the collapse of society to essentially buy everything up on the cheap once society does collapse and become the feudal overlords of whatever emerges from the ashes of the now destroyed planet. Um, Again, this is my opinion, but I think anybody paying close enough attention can kind of see the direction that we are heading. In this book, the world is governed as a kleptocracy. A kleptocracy essentially means rule by thieves, rule by thievery. And we're pretty much already there. I mean, a lot of the economic productivity of everybody on Earth is being siphoned up into a speculative bubble at the top of the US economy, at the top of the global economy, that just churns money around, and they use the money that they have sitting in those bank accounts to get loans, to borrow more money, to invest that money in private equity, which buys up Red Lobster and strips it for parts and bankrupts the business. But they don't care because they already made their profits back, and they're essentially just hollowing out every single facet of the quote unquote real economy until nothing's left but this giant ball of cash and, you know, private islands and real estate that they've managed to sequester away in the hidden corners of the global banking system. So I think that Trump himself may believe that tariffs are a good thing, but I think those around him have not, you know, drunk the Kool-Aid. They're not that stupid. They know that this will be terrible for the U.S. economy in the long run, but they don't care. They want the U.S. economy to collapse. They want society to collapse because once society collapses, they get to be the ones in charge. They get to be the ones that hold the absolute political and economic power over the lives of the everyday citizens. And this is especially rampant, I think, in the tech sector, where there's, again, this whole techno-fascist, techno-feudalism arc that we're seeing play out in real time. Okay, I highly recommend the book, by the way. It's a very good read. Okay, I think I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you for watching. If you made it this far, hopefully this was one of my more coherent rants. I'm still working on Why Trump Won Part 4. I want to get it out sometime in October. We'll see if that actually happens. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Share if you thought it was interesting or if I made good points. If you have any corrections or any questions for me, do not hesitate to leave a comment. Okay, I will catch y'all on the flip side.